Matthew chapter 10 is where we're going to start. Matthew chapter 10. We are starting a collection of sermons that we're talking about the subject of no good addiction. What does that mean? It means that we have addictions in our culture that we think are wrong and evil and we shouldn't do, but there are also other addictions in our life that are actually culturally acceptable and that we just are okay with as a culture. But even if we're comfortable with it as a culture, that does not mean that they're good for our soul, good for our own personal well-being, or what Jesus' best for us is. And so we're going to talk about some of those. You say, well, what does that even mean? Well, let me give you one. We're not talking about this today, but let me give you one. How many of y'all would say, I might have a little bit of a coffee addiction? How many of y'all would say, how many of y'all would say, if I don't drink coffee for 3 or 4 days, I'm gonna start getting a caffeine headache? Where y'all at? Y'all might, okay, that's called withdrawals. I don't know if y'all know that, but that's called a addiction, just a little bit. We all have some type of addiction in our life, and we wanna deal with some that have just been culturally acceptable. So let's open the scripture together. Matthew chapter 10. We're gonna start in verse 38. It says this. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village. And a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And as she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve you alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. I pray that as we read it and we absorb it and we consume it, you'd speak to us, you'd change us, you'd shape us, you'd mold us into your image. Speak to us. Let us be changed by the reading and discussion of your word. We ask these things in your name, Jesus Christ, the strong Son of God. Amen and amen. Have you ever had somebody that was a close friend or relative that you would consider is easily distracted? Have you ever had that, like that person? Maybe there's a person in your family. We like to call it ADD or ADHD. Like they're easily distracted. And I don't mean like easily distracted in as much that we're talking about like, oh, squirrel, but like the details of the things that are going on around you distract them from the moment that you find yourself in. I worked for a pastor probably, almost 15 years ago. He hired me at my first role, and I can remember working with this guy and going to eat with him and spending time with him. And if everything like worked out in the restaurant, he was good. But like if service was really bad or things didn't come out the way that he thought, dude just couldn't get over it. Like it bothered him so much that if it wasn't the way he expected it in his head, it would distract him from the moment. Have you ever had that happen to you before? Maybe you haven't been distracted at a dinner table at a restaurant, but maybe you find yourself distracted when your kids run in the room or when your spouse comes into the room. You're still doing stuff for work or you're trying to accomplish something. And there's a moment there that we find ourselves, instead of being present for, are distracting us from that moment. That whatever is going on in our mind or whatever we think we need to accomplish or whatever we think we need to produce is keeping us from being really present in that moment. We would call this in basic terms, that could be other things, but we would call this someone who is addicted to work. Or we would call it a workaholic. Or another way to say it is addicted to producing or making something happen or feeling like they're accomplishing something. We live in a culture that is obsessed with work and producing. We live in a culture that is obsessed with getting things done the quickest way, the most efficient way, as fast as possible. That is where we live our life. And what is insane is that we begin to develop paces that we celebrate because we think, oh, well, we're accomplishing the most, without ever asking the question, is the pace in which I'm keeping healthy? Is the pace in which I'm keeping actually good for my soul or good for me as a human being? You know, the world that we live in, there's a bunch of info that you can actually look up if you just Google it. But did you know that over 80%, for those of us who work vocationally, over 80% of people who work vocationally work at least on average 10 hours more a week than they're paid for? A minimum of 10 hours more a week. Did you know that I think it's 35% of people, after they work that 10 hours more a week, are sitting in their homes at a dinner table checking emails from the job that they just overworked from? It's awkward, isn't it? Because we know we kind of like do that. And what we do is we live in a culture where we celebrate it, where we say this is the mark, that the people who work the hardest, the people that are the most available, those are the people that we celebrate. And look, for those of you who are in a sales environment, I get it. Like, your job is commission-based, and you work your tail off, whether you own a business or you own a business that gives a service or sells something, you kind of feel like a slave to the cell phone. You kind of feel like, well, I gotta answer the phone. I mean, what if I lose money? And we live in this pace that is not healthy. We live in this pace that causes us to be so distracted by producing and so distracted by doing that we miss millions of moments in our life to be present, not only with God, but the ones whom God has placed in our life. And it's actually an addiction. You say, well, how is it an addiction? If you do the study, there's several studies that you can read online, but the people who produce the most in their life, the people who produce the most often show excessive dopamine hits in their brain when they accomplish something. So we actually have this thing happening inside of our own bodies that gives us almost like a pump or a burst of energy when we produce something. It actually shows that the amount of dopamine from accomplishing something for people who are more laid back and are less focused on getting stuff done is actually significantly less. But if you live in the world of, man, I just got to get stuff done, you are actually, the more that you give yourself away to that thought and that process, you are actually making it more addictive like behavior. But we celebrate it. We act like it's the best thing in the world because we make more money because of it, or because we get celebrated at work, or because we feel this sense of accomplishment. And when Jesus is in this moment with Mary and Martha, Martha invites Jesus into their house. And Martha begins to do all of these things and all of this work. And she is so distracted, even though she's the one that invited Jesus into her house. She's so distracted by things to do and producing to make it a good experience for Jesus. She's so worried about producing that she misses the opportunity to be present with Christ. She even complains to Jesus. She says, now wait a minute. Now wait a minute. We're talking about getting things done, right, Jesus? And you're here and we're supposed to take care of you. I'm doing all the stuff. You need to tell Mary to get off her butt. Like, you need to pick it up. Like, you need to tell her to pick it up. I'm working my tail off, and she's sitting there, and Jesus says, I don't think you understand. The point is not to do. The point is to embrace the presence of the Lord. Now, two things we got to kind of get out of the way because everybody wants to be the devil's advocate or be the exception to the rule. But first of all, there are seasons for all of us where we work harder than other seasons. Like, we all understand that, right? Like, especially if you're self-employed or you lead an organization, there are seasons where you know that you're going to put more time and energy in. The problem is that for most of us, if we're more wired to be a workaholic, if we're more wired to be that way, instead of when that season slows down, we fill our time with more things to just keep us going at the same pace. I am so proud. One of the things that I love about our church is that every single person on our staff is a type 1A go-getter all the time. But it's funny because during the summer, I have to tell them on a regular basis, hey, like, take a day and rest. Like, take a day and not be here as late as you normally are, because this is a season. During the summer, we have a lot of stuff going on, but there are certain aspects of the summer that allow there to be a little more flexibility, spending more time with your kids, all of that kind of stuff. And believe it or not, I have to tell myself the same thing. Because if you say, well, I am wired to just be the person who's always getting stuff done, I relate to that. But we have to learn to recognize that we were not meant to run like that constantly. We were not meant to just go and go and go and go and go like that constantly. The other side of it is oftentimes when we read this passage of Scripture, if you've ever been in a spot where we're reading this, we often demonize Martha. It's not about demonizing Martha. Like, I don't know if y'all have noticed, but like, we need people that can get stuff done on a regular basis in our life. Like, we need those people. It's not that people who are efficient and are hard workers are somehow evil in this story, and the people who just sit at Jesus' feet are the heroes. No. It's about understanding that we are called, whether we are more likely to be highly relational and laid back, or if we're the person who is the person with the checklist that just wants to make sure all the widgets go into the right box, regardless of which area of life you find yourself in personally, we're called to find that balance. We're called to find the space to understand that both matter. Things need to get done, but I also need to be able to embrace the life that Christ has called me to and the family and the people that Christ has called me to without ignoring them because of things and doing. Why do we struggle with workaholism? Like, why is it hard for us? Why is it difficult for us to just be and not let our schedules go nuts? The first is this, that in our culture, that we value doing in our culture more than being. We value doing in our culture more than being. We do this in almost every aspect. We celebrate the accomplishment of things. We celebrate doing. We don't celebrate, I sat on my butt on Friday and took a nap and then hung out with my kids and played checkers. We don't celebrate that. As a matter of fact, for probably a lot of us in here, I don't know if you're like me, there's part of me that like sometimes knows like there's value in that, but there's also like a little birdie in my head that's going, you could be doing something else. Anybody else? Anybody else? You need that. But you need to recognize that voice in your brain and say, oh, no. That is not actually Christ-centered or healthy. You need to be able to recognize that and say, man, if I'm going to live the life that God's called me to, and if I'm not going to run around with this common addiction in our culture, then I've got to understand that I need to be more than I need to do. It's choosing to slow your pace down. The second reason that we live in this tension is because we structure our lives with an impossible pace. We structure our lives with an impossible pace. Most of us have said this sentence when we get back from a trip. I need a vacation from my vacation. Anybody said that? That's like a problem, y'all. Like, that's an issue. That even in our, quote, leisure time, we stack our schedule up at such a pace that we're not doing anything that's actually helpful to our body. What we're actually doing is making it even worse so that we come back and jump in the rhythm of life. We're that much more exhausted. I remember I worked for a pastor one time that he went on a 3-month sabbatical. And when he came back from the sabbatical, I remembered, because I was kind of worried about it. I knew what his schedule was going to be as he was gone. He looked at me and goes, I'm more tired than when I left. He took all these trips. I was like, dude, do you know what sabbatical means? It's literally for you to rest and come back ready to go for the next season. That's the whole point. It's like, I'm just exhausted. He left that church 5 months after that moment. You know why? Because he developed a pace in life that eventually caught up to him. And the challenge is, most of us think, oh, I can handle the pace I'm living. I'm good. Like, I can handle it. You know, I'm not going to have a heart attack and die. I can continue the pace. But when we allow ourselves to live a pace that is impossible long term for us to do and be healthy, it's when things like pornography addiction comes up, alcohol abuse comes up. You know why? Because instead of restructuring our life, we do something that relieves the stress of the life that we created instead of dealing with the life that we've created. And instead of reorganizing our life to go at a slower pace, we find little spaces of relief. I was reading a book last week, and there was a stat that absolutely blew my mind. Because I don't know about you, but have you ever felt like you were comparing the pace of your life to like old school living? Well, like, man, these people got up at the butt crack of dawn and they just worked and worked and worked and then they died. You know, like, have you ever like looked at that? Especially if you're like, you know, a millennial. There's something about like, there's this idea that somehow all millennials like work less hard, which isn't true. It isn't true. If you think it's true, come and look at my schedule for 5 minutes. I promise you will think differently. But there's kind of been that, well, the older generation work harder. Do you know that between the Revolutionary and the Civil War, the average person slept 11 hours a day? 11. As in one sitting beside a one. 11. I definitely called bullcrap a little bit when I was reading the book. You know what I'm saying? Like, you hear that and you go, no, that's not true. And you think about it. These people didn't binge watch Netflix. They got up when the sun came up, and they went to bed when the sun went down. Because all there was dinner, making babies, and sleep. That's like all they had to do. That's it. And most of those things don't take too long. You know what I'm saying? So like, I'm just saying, they lived at a different pace. And we sit around and act like somehow, out of insecurity or out of fear, that we're not doing enough, when we're the people who've made the pace of life impossible to live. Because somehow we have all of these efficiencies that should make it easier, yet we're sleeping less, we're spending time with our families less, we're doing things that matter less because we're more obsessed with doing than being. I think the other reason that we struggle with it is because we celebrate unhealthy behavior. Look, I'm not blaming anybody that I've ever worked for this at all. But I definitely, from day one of the first job I ever made a dime at that wasn't working for my parents, thought my job was to walk in and work harder than everybody else and accomplish more and do more. I definitely felt that. And in sales, if you've ever done sales, like, we celebrate that. I remember this moment that should have felt so good, but it scared the bejesus out of me. I had a boss that I did really, really well. in sales one month at this job. And he printed up on a poster board, because they used to do like landscape style pictures of where everybody was for that month. Y'all know what I'm talking about? If you've been in sales, you've probably been there. You see like the lines of who did the best. He had to print it in portrait mode because of how well I had done that month, to show literally on paper how much better it was. It was mostly because I had one really, really large sale that month. And he looked at all of them and he said, man, you guys all stink except for this guy. Now, the funny part is, most of those people did better than me the month before and the month after. But he's just giving them crap because on paper, for 1 4-week period, I smoked them. And he looks at me, he's like, y'all need to get on Andy's page. And then he said something that stuck with me for the rest of the time I was in sales. Because today is a new month, and even for Andy, nothing you just did mattered. It's all about the next month. And I could feel the honor at some level of being the guy celebrated for killing it, but I also went back to a place of pressure feeling, oh crap, am I going to be able to pull this off twice? Why did I think that way? Because he celebrated what was probably actually not the healthiest thing, was me going at a pace that was not good for my soul or good for me long term. We don't see it. We just think, it'll be fine. The worst season I ever spent in my life, time-wise, was when I was in college. I was a full-time student. I was working a full-time traveling sales job. I was an intern on a nationally syndicated radio and television show. And I would start my mornings at 3:30. And then I would go till about 11 o'clock at night. And then I would go to sleep and wake up and do the same thing all over again. I would do that 5 days a week. And then on Friday night, I had evening jobs that I did that would keep me busy till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And then the next morning, I would wake up and do it again. You know what the crazy part is? I only did this for a semester. But I found myself pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing because I felt like I was accomplishing so much. And I did not realize that I had adapted my body to live on 3 hours of sleep. I was falling asleep at red lights, and I wasn't even aware that I was doing it. And I put on 40 pounds in 4 months. I don't know if y'all know, that ain't good. I mean, I've never been skinny, but like 40 extra is a lot. And I didn't even notice. I remember the last day of the internship. It was right when the school time was ending, and I was exhausted. And I said, I'm just going to take the day. I'm going to take a little cat nap, and then tomorrow I'll get back in the groove. I slept for about 18 hours. You know what the problem with that is? I did not know I was tired until I slept for 18 hours and woke up and went, oh, it's a different day than when I went to sleep. We don't even realize that we're doing it. Because we celebrate unhealthy behavior, because we live at paces that are not healthy for us, and because we're so obsessed with accomplishing and producing, we don't even realize how unhealthy the paces we're keeping are. But Christ has called us to be people who slow down and realize that perhaps the greatest gift, not just to Christ, but to your family, to your spouses, to yourself, can be being present and not just trying to produce, and not just trying to accomplish. So how do we do that? How do we choose to do that? There's a few different things that we have to do. First of all, we have to choose to be present. We have to choose to let go of doing and allow ourselves to be. One of the things I think is interesting in this passage, is that when Jesus is talking to Martha, and she is chastising Mary for just sitting at his feet. Jesus looks at him and says, you are anxious about a lot. You are anxious about a lot, and you are troubled about a lot. And that's why you're so concerned with being and doing. It's not that she was just simply worried about getting things done, but there was an unhealthy anxiousness that caused her to be more focused on doing than being. And if we're going to release this addiction of workaholism that many of us have, we have to start with the question of why. Why am I struggling to just do stuff all the time? Why am I constantly feeling out my schedule in a way that is causing me to just run at a pace that's not healthy? For some of us, it's insecurity. For some of us, it's fear. I know when I was in sales, that was my thought. That was my whole thought. Like, if I don't do as well as I did the last month, I won't cut it. If I don't accomplish the same thing that I accomplished last month, this month, then I don't matter anymore. For many of us, the why is because we've connected doing with our identity. And Christ is calling us to disconnect those. To disconnect those things and realize that whether or not you are successful, and whether or not you produce, and whether or not you make everything happen, to Jesus, you are still a son and daughter of God. That you still matter. And your matter, like that whether or not you matter to God, is in no way connected to what you produce. And it's in no way connected to what you do. And I know a lot of you, like especially the men in the room, you're sitting there, well, Andy, I don't know if you know this, but my kids eat. You know, I had a guy tell me, he was like, since school got out, he said it this morning. He was like, my kids eat way more when they're not in school than when they're in school. Like, I get it. I get it. But we're also not talking to a culture. I would say this about the culture in which we live in. We live in a get your hands dirty, get to work culture. I really don't think laziness is really very common in Ulysses, Kansas. You know what I'm saying? Like, we are people who know what it's like to get up and go to work and get stuff done and accomplish things. And I'm not saying that you need to go buy some bonbons and just sit for 3 months and not do nothing. But are you balancing who I am in Christ? Or is my why because the only identity I have is what I bring to the table? I have to start with why. The second is this, is that I have to learn to value being present over doing. To value being present over doing. My son walked up to me the other day. I was on the phone with a really good friend of mine who was kind of going through his own deal. And he goes, Daddy, I got to talk to you. My son, if you don't know, I have 2 kids. Jackson's 7, Eden's 6. And Jackson goes, I got to talk to you, Dad. I said, well, hang on just a second. He was like, I've got to talk to you. And I said, okay, hey, man, I got to let you go. My son needs something. And he looks at me and he goes, Dad, I just don't understand. I said, what? What don't you understand? He goes, if we're not allowed to print money at home, how come the bank has a money printing machine? And I thought, you got me off the phone for why does the bank have a money printing machine? By the way, apparently I need to hang out at your house, Chris, because y'all got a money printing machine at the bank, right? Like that's that's apparently really cool. I didn't know that was a thing. But but in the moment it seemed ridiculous. But you know what that moment taught my son? If he needs me, I will stop what I'm doing and listen to what he has to say. And you know what? Shame on me for even for a moment going, Well, that was dumb. I was in the point of a real conversation here. Because those moments aren't just about the silliness of their questions. It's about how you respond to them. And if you haven't spent time with your kids without your cell phones in the last 3 months, there's a problem. And look, I'm guilty of it too. We played Uno for like 45 minutes last night. Now, I intentionally put my phone and do not disturb and just set it over to the side. I had to do something before we started playing, and I set it to the side. And for 45 minutes, it was embarrassing how many times I thought, I wonder if I have a text message. I wonder what's on the headlines of all of the news apps that I have. And the Lord is I'm not just saying this because you need to hear it. I'm saying I need to hear it. The Lord's trying to teach us. We have summer coming. And if you have kids or family in the area, we need to take the time that we have and embrace the season that we're in. And not fill it with all of the things that we want to accomplish, but find time to be present. The last thing that we need to do is call it what it is. It's an addiction. We need to call it what it is. It's not your personality type. It's not just your natural tendency. It's an issue. And Jesus is talking to Martha, and he says, I get that you're troubled by some stuff. But Mary's doing, one translation says, the greater thing. And that's learning to be present. It's learning to be present. Several years ago, it'd be almost 11 now, Jessica and I got married, and we moved to Florida to go serve at a church. I told this story, by the way, at a First Wednesday a few months ago. And when we went to Florida, I inherited a youth ministry that had a building about 80% the size of this facility. It was a very large facility, and it was gross. It smelled funny. There were old couches in it, so bad that Goodwill wouldn't take them. True story. We had to get like a roll-off to dump all of these nasty couches that they had in there. And part of my job was to do a renovation on the facility. Well, it came time to paint the facility. And it was a church. It was going to cost like $4 or $5 grand in paint by itself. The building was just very large. And so I stacked a schedule of people for 7 days, from a Sunday afternoon, well, almost 7, all the way, well, yeah, I guess it would be 7, to Saturday late at night. And we started painting at 6 a.m., and I didn't stop. The earliest I stopped was 2 o'clock in the morning every night. And then we'd be back at 6 a.m. working with a different team, and we just rotated. But I was there with every single team. I was exhausted, easily 100 hours in that week. But we got it done. And on that Monday, I walked in feeling pretty good about myself. Because we got that junk done, and it looked great. Except for all the paint in the carpet, but that's what's happening when you let children paint. So, like, teenagers, not so good. So, yeah, it was pretty ugly on the carpet. But the walls looked good, so whatever. And Phil, the guy that I worked for at the time, the pastor of the church, he said, hey, come here real quick. He's like, that building looks good. I was like, thanks so much. He's like, I bet you put in a lot of hours on that building. Yes, sir. He said, well, how much did you put in? I said, well, I got there about 6 a.m. every morning, had different people meet me. We painted till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. One night it was even to 4. And he was like, oh, wow, you probably put in 100 hours. And I said, yes, sir. And I thought he was about to give me like a bonus check or like at least an attaboy. And he looks at me and he says, if you ever do that again, I'll fire you. And I went, come again? You know, like I'm still getting Charlie horses from all of this, you know, like I'm exhausted. And he looks at me and he says, you have a wife that you are committed to first before this church. And he said, and that tells me that you didn't spend an ounce of time with her this week. He said, we got staff, but when staff's over, you go home and I don't want to see you till Wednesday. He said, if you ever do that again, consider it a formal warning, I'll fire you. Phil did something for me that day that my soul needed. And that was for somebody to stop celebrating what in my mind made me successful and help me understand that what really mattered was being present with God and being present with the people that I love. It is honestly, in nearly 15 years of ministry, one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given as a pastor. Because he helped me see that it really was addictive. Producing gave success, which gave validation, which made it a part of my identity, and it just circulated. What I want to tell you today is you are not what you do. You are not what you produce. And the moment that we allow ourselves to attach to that, we actually miss out on embracing the identity that Christ desires for us to have, which we are sons and daughters of the King. It may seem like a good addiction, but it's not.